You don't belong in first class. The words didn't echo. They cut, sharp, deliberate, final, ripping through the quiet cabin before the engines even had a chance to start. And just like that, every head within a 10-foot radius turned toward seat 2A where Darius Cole stood, boarding pass in hand, expression unreadable, dressed in nothing more than a fitted black t-shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen better days, the kind of outfit that made people assume things, the wrong things, the kind that made people comfortable, making decisions they would soon regret. The flight attendant didn't hesitate, her fingers already gripping the edge of his ticket as if it were disposable, as if he were, and with a quick motion that felt louder than it should have been, she tore it clean in half, the sound slicing through the cabin like a signal that something had just shifted, something invisible but undeniable. And still, Darius didn't react, not a flinch, not a raised voice, just silence, the kind of silence that didn't ask for attention but commanded it anyway, the kind that made people uneasy without knowing why. A man in a tailored blazer a few rows back leaned over to his wife and whispered something under his breath. She nodded without taking her eyes off the scene, while across the aisle a young woman slowly lifted her phone, not to interfere, just to capture, because moments like this had a way of becoming something bigger. Sir, economy is toward the back, the attendant added, her tone now laced with impatience, already turning her body away from him like the decision had been made, and there was nothing left to discuss. And just behind her, another crew member chuckled softly, the kind of laugh that wasn't meant to be heard but always was. Darius glanced once at the torn pieces in his hand, then at the seat, 2A, where a well-dressed couple was now settling in, their carry-on tucked neatly under the seat, their drinks already being offered, as if the transition had been planned, as if he had simply been erased from the equation. 10 years earlier, in a different airport, a different gate, Darius had stood in a similar moment, holding a valid ticket while someone told him he didn't fit the profile. And back then he had argued. Back then he had tried to explain. Back then he had believed that clarity would fix everything. But that version of him was gone now, replaced by something quieter, sharper, something that didn't need to convince anyone of anything. I scanned his ticket. A voice said suddenly from behind the galley, hesitant but clear. A trainee stepping just far enough into view to be seen, but not enough to feel safe. It showed green, she added, and for a split second the air tightened. The kind of pause where truth tries to surface but gets pushed back down just as quickly. The attendant didn't even look at her, just waved a dismissive hand. Then you scanned it wrong, she said flatly, already reaching for her tablet. Fingers moving fast across the screen, too fast, like she was correcting something that wasn't supposed to exist. Darius watched it all without moving, without interrupting, his gaze steady, his breathing even, as if he were observing a process rather than being part of it, as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere far beyond this cabin, and maybe it had. Another passenger stood halfway up from his seat, glancing between Darius and the crew, unsure whether to speak or stay silent, while the young woman with the phone adjusted her angle, whispering under her breath, "This isn't right." And just like that, the cabin was no longer just a place of departure. It had become something else. Entirely a stage, a pressure point, a moment waiting to break. And at the center of it, Darius Cole finally shifted his weight, not toward the back of the plane, not toward the exit, but forward, just one step, his voice low, controlled, almost calm enough to miss. "Go ahead," he said, eyes locking onto the attendant. "Finish what you started." The attendant did not like the way he said it. Not loud, not aggressive, but certain, like a man who had already decided how this moment would end. And for the first time her smile faltered just slightly before she straightened her posture and doubled down. "I already did," she replied, tapping her tablet again with more force than necessary, her voice now carrying further down the aisle as if she needed the entire cabin to agree with her version of events. "There is no record of you in this seat." And that word record hung in the air heavier than it should have, because a few seconds ago there had been one. The trainee knew it, Darius knew it, and now it was gone, erased with a few quick motions and a confident tone. The couple in 2A avoided eye contact, the man adjusting his cuff while the woman stared at the window like the runway outside had suddenly become fascinating, neither of them asking questions, neither of them wanting to, because comfort has a way of silencing curiosity. "Sir, I need you to step aside so we can finish boarding," the attendant continued, her patience thinning into something sharper, something closer to irritation, and from behind her a second crew member leaned in and added, "Do not make this harder than it needs to be." As if the situation itself had not already been made difficult for him, Darius remained exactly where he was, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, the kind of stillness that did not challenge authority but did not submit to it either. And that was what unsettled them most, because they could not categorize it, could not control it. A few rows back, the young woman recording shifted her phone slightly and whispered, "They deleted his seat," her voice low but picked up by the microphone anyway. And almost immediately the man beside her nodded. "I saw that too." And just like that, the room began to split, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, into those who believed what they were told and those who trusted what they saw. "Emily, that is enough," the lead attendant snapped without turning around, her tone directed at the trainee who had spoken earlier. "Return to your position." But Emily did not move right away, her hands gripping the edge of the galley counter as she glanced once more at Darius, then back at the tablet, then at the growing number of eyes watching, and something in her expression shifted from hesitation to resolve. "I did not scan it wrong," she said, louder this time, and that single sentence landed harder than any raised voice could have, because it was not emotional. It was factual, and facts were harder to dismiss when they were repeated. The lead attendant exhaled sharply, a controlled breath that carried frustration, then turned fully toward Darius for the first time since tearing his ticket, her gaze narrowing as if trying to read him, to find something that justified what she had already done, but all she found was calm, the kind that did not crack under pressure, the kind that suggested this was not new to him. 10 years earlier, standing in a smaller terminal with fewer witnesses, Darius had watched a gate agent question his presence in almost the same words, the same tone, the same quiet certainty that he did not belong. And back then he had explained, had shown documents, had waited for someone to correct the mistake. But now he understood something different, something more permanent, that the issue was never the ticket, never the system. It was the assumption behind it. "Last call, sir," the second crew member said, stepping slightly closer, not touching him, but closing the distance just enough to signal escalation. "Either move to the back or we will have to involve airport security." And the word security rippled through the nearby rows, causing a few passengers to shift uncomfortably, because now it was no longer just about a seat. It was about authority being enforced. Darius finally tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in acknowledgement, like he had been waiting for that exact line, his gaze moving briefly toward the cockpit door, then back to the attendant. And when he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before, calm enough that the people closest had to lean in to catch it. "Go ahead," he said, "call whoever you need." A pause, just long enough to let the weight of the moment settle, but make sure they are ready to listen. The shift happened quietly, not with a shout, but with a signal, as the lead attendant turned sharply toward the front of the cabin and lifted the intercom handset with a practiced motion that carried authority. "Captain, we have a situation in first class," she said, her voice controlled but tight, and within seconds the cockpit door cracked open. Just enough for a tall man in a pressed uniform to step out, his presence immediate, his posture firm, the kind of authority that did not need introduction. Captain Reynolds scanned the scene once, his eyes moving from the torn boarding pass in Darius's hand to the occupied seat, then to the phones raised discreetly throughout the cabin, and finally settling on Darius himself, lingering there for half a second longer than expected, as if trying to place something he could not quite name. "What is going on here?" he asked, not loudly, but with a tone that expected clarity, and the lead attendant responded instantly, stepping into the explanation before anyone else could speak. "Passenger is refusing to comply with seating instructions, claims a first-class seat that does not exist in the system." Her words clean, confident, rehearsed, the kind that turned a complex situation into a simple narrative. Captain Reynolds nodded once, then addressed Darius directly. "Sir, I need you to move to your assigned seat so we can depart on time." And there it was, the assumption sealed into instruction, the decision already made before the question was asked. Darius did not move, his gaze steady, his voice level. I am already in my assigned seat, he said, not defensive, not aggressive, just factual, and the simplicity of it created a ripple through the nearby rows, a quiet tension that made people lean in rather than look away. There is no record of that. The attendant cut in quickly, holding up her tablet like proof, and for a moment it worked, because screens have a way of convincing people that what they show is the truth, even when it is not. But then Emily stepped forward again, this time fully into the aisle, her voice steadier than before. There was, she said, eyes on the captain now, not the attendant. I saw it on the manifest before it was changed, and the word changed landed differently than before. Heavier, more deliberate, because it implied action, not error. Captain Reynolds's expression tightened just slightly, his eyes flicking to the tablet, then back to Darius, then to the passengers whose phones were no longer hidden, the moment no longer private, the pressure no longer contained. Emily, that is not your role. The attendant snapped, but the captain raised a hand just enough to quiet her, a small gesture that shifted control of the room. Sir, he said again, this time slower, more measured. If there has been a misunderstanding, we can resolve it after boarding, but right now I need cooperation. And the word cooperation echoed through the space like a test, because it suggested that resistance was the problem, not the cause. Darius tilted his head slightly, considering, not the request but the timing of it, the pattern of it, the familiarity of it, because he had heard that same phrase before in boardrooms and terminals and offices where decisions were made quickly and corrected slowly. 10 years earlier, he had chosen to cooperate, had stepped aside, had waited for resolution that never came in the moment it mattered, but today felt different, not because of the place, not because of the people, but because of the position he now held, one that did not rely on permission. He let a second pass, then another, long enough for the silence to grow uncomfortable, for the captain to feel it, for the room to notice it, and when he finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational, but it carried further than before. Captain, he said, meeting his eyes directly, before you make that call, I suggest you check who you are asking to move. And that was it. No raised tone, no explanation, just a sentence that shifted the weight of the moment from confrontation to curiosity, from assumption to doubt, and in that space, something began to change. For a moment, the cabin held its breath, not because anyone understood exactly what Darius meant, but because of how he said it, calm, deliberate, like a man who had just introduced a variable no one else had accounted for. And Captain Reynolds felt it first, that subtle shift, the kind that does not show on a screen but settles in the gut, forcing him to pause longer than protocol allowed. His eyes moved again, slower this time, studying Darius not as a disruption but as a possibility, while behind him the lead attendant tightened her grip on the tablet, her confidence beginning to strain under the weight of attention she could no longer control. Captain, we do not have time for this, she pressed, her voice sharper now, pushing him back toward the original narrative. We need to close the door in 3 minutes. But time had already stretched, those 3 minutes no longer belonging to the schedule, but to the moment unfolding in front of them. Darius did not repeat himself, did not elaborate. He simply stood there, steady, letting the silence do the work. Because silence, when held long enough, forces people to fill it with questions, and questions were exactly what this situation had been avoiding. Emily took another step forward, her voice quieter but firmer, directed at the captain. Sir, the system log updates in real time. If a name disappears that fast, it does not just vanish, it is removed. And this time no one cut her off immediately, not because they agreed, but because too many people were listening now, too many cameras capturing, too many witnesses connecting the same dots. A man in the second row leaned into the aisle, speaking just loud enough to be heard. I watched her change something on that screen. And another voice followed from across the cabin. This does not feel right. And just like that, the room was no longer a controlled environment. It was a conversation, and conversations are harder to contain than commands. Captain Reynolds exhaled slowly, a measured breath, then turned slightly toward the attendant, lowering his voice just enough to create a private edge within a public moment. Pull up the full manifest history, he said, not as a suggestion but as a directive. And for the first time since this began, the attendant hesitated, her fingers hovering above the tablet instead of moving across it, because history is harder to adjust than the present, and once opened, it does not easily close. It is not necessary, she replied, attempting to maintain control, but the words lacked the certainty they carried before, and that small crack was enough for everyone to notice. Darius watched it unfold without interruption, his posture unchanged, his presence anchoring the space in a way that no uniform or title could replicate, because authority built over time does not need to announce itself. It reveals itself when tested. 10 years earlier, he had stood in a different line, holding a document that proved his place, only to be told that systems could make mistakes, that verification would take time, that patience was required, and back then he had accepted it, had stepped aside, had allowed the moment to pass without correction. But today was not about proving access, it was about exposing assumption. Captain, Darius said again, his voice even, drawing attention without raising volume. You are about to delay a flight based on incomplete information. A pause, just enough to let the implication settle. Or you can verify it before you escalate. And the choice was clear now, not framed as defiance, but as responsibility. Captain Reynolds glanced once more at the passengers, at the phones, at the growing tension that no longer felt manageable, then back at the attendant, and in that exchange something shifted, subtle but decisive, as he extended his hand, not aggressively, not abruptly, but firmly. Give me the tablet, he said, and for a fraction of a second the entire cabin seemed to lean forward, because everyone understood that whatever appeared on that screen next would not just resolve a seating issue, it would define everything that had happened up to this point. The hesitation lingered just a second too long, long enough for everyone to see it, long enough for doubt to replace certainty. And when Captain Reynolds did not lower his hand, when he did not repeat himself, the attendant finally passed him the tablet, but not with confidence, not with control, her fingers releasing it slowly as if she already knew that whatever lived inside that screen was no longer on her side. The captain turned slightly away from the aisle, angling the display toward himself, his thumb moving deliberately as he navigated past the current seating chart, past the simplified interface, into the deeper layers that most passengers never knew existed, the system behind the system, the one that did not just show what is, but what was, and in that quiet movement, the cabin seemed to shrink, every conversation fading, every whisper pulling back into silence as eyes fixed on a screen they could not see but could feel. Darius did not step closer, did not try to look. He simply waited, his posture unchanged, his presence steady, because he did not need to confirm what he already understood. This was never about data. It was about whether someone would choose to look at it honestly. Emily held her breath near the galley, her eyes locked on the captain, while the passengers with phones kept recording, not moving, not speaking, as if even a whisper might disrupt what was about to surface. Captain Reynolds scrolled once, then again, his expression tightening just slightly, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough that the shift was there if you were paying attention. And then he stopped, his thumb hovering for a fraction of a second before tapping into the manifest history log, the section that tracked every change, every update, every adjustment made in real time. 10 years earlier, Darius had been told that systems were neutral, that they did not see color, did not see clothing, did not see perception. But what he learned over time was simpler and more dangerous. Systems only reflect the people who control them, and in the wrong hands, even the most precise technology becomes a tool for quiet decisions that leave no visible trace, unless someone knows exactly where to look. What is it? The attendant asked, her voice lower now, no longer projecting, no longer certain, and the captain did not answer immediately, because he was reading, not just scanning, his eyes moving across timestamps, names, seat assignments, each line telling a version of the story that had just played out in front of him. The first entry showed Darius Cole assigned to seat 2A, confirmed, validated. The second entry showed no issue, no flag, no discrepancy. And then the third entry, the one that changed everything, a manual update, recent, precise, removing the name and reassigning the seat, not due to system error, not due to overbooking, but through direct input. The captain's jaw tightened just slightly as he scrolled back once more, confirming what he was seeing. Not rushing, not reacting, because this was no longer about speed. It was about accuracy, and accuracy carries weight. A man in the second row leaned forward again, whispering, "He found something." And though the words were quiet, they spread faster than any announcement could, because people could feel it now, the shift from assumption to evidence, from control to exposure. Darius finally moved, not forward, not back, just a slight adjustment of his stance, his gaze steady on the captain, not challenging, not demanding, just present, as if to say this moment belongs to you now. What you do next defines it. Captain Reynolds lifted his eyes from the screen, not yet speaking, not yet addressing the room, but looking first at the attendant, then at Darius. And in that silence, everything that had been said before began to unravel, because the truth was no longer abstract. It was documented, time-stamped, undeniable, and the only question left was not what happened, but who would be willing to say it out loud. Captain Reynolds did not rush the moment, and that was what made it heavier, because instead of reacting, instead of deflecting, he turned the tablet slightly and read the line again, silently confirming what he already understood, that the system had not failed, it had been used, and used deliberately. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, not carrying authority for the sake of control, but for the sake of truth. "This seat was reassigned manually," he said, not loudly, but clearly enough for the surrounding rows to hear. And the words landed like a quiet shock, because they did not accuse, they revealed. The lead attendant stiffened immediately, her posture tightening as if she could hold her position through presence alone. "That is not accurate," she replied quickly, but the speed of her response worked against her now, sounding less like confidence and more like urgency. And Captain Reynolds did not look away from the screen. "Timestamp shows a manual. Override less than 2 minutes ago," he continued, his tone unchanged. No system flag, no overbook condition. And with each word, the version of events that had been presented earlier began to lose structure, piece by piece. A ripple moved through the cabin, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable, as passengers exchanged glances, some lowering their phones slightly as if the recording had already captured enough, others raising them higher because they sensed something more was coming. Emily exhaled slowly, her shoulders dropping just a fraction as validation replaced doubt, while the man in the second row leaned back into his seat, shaking his head once, quietly, like he had just witnessed something he had seen before, but never this clearly. Darius remained still, his eyes on the captain, not pressing, not interrupting, because this was the moment where the truth had to stand on its own, without assistance, without argument, and that was always the hardest part for people who had relied on control rather than accuracy. 10 years earlier, he had been told to wait while someone verified his identity, and in that waiting, the moment had passed, the correction had come too late to matter. But today there was no waiting, no delay, because everything was unfolding in real time, in front of witnesses, in a space that could not be rewound. "Captain, we are behind schedule," the attendant said again, her voice tightening, trying to redirect the focus back to time, to urgency, to anything that could pull attention away from the screen. But time no longer held the same authority it did minutes ago, because now the cost of moving forward without correction was visible. Captain Reynolds finally lifted his gaze from the tablet and looked directly at her, not with anger, not with confrontation, but with something more difficult to manage, expectation. "Why was the seat reassigned?" he asked, and it was not a rhetorical question, not a formality, it was a requirement, because once a fact is established, the reason behind it becomes unavoidable. The attendant opened her mouth to respond, then paused, just for a second, but that second was enough. Enough for everyone to see that the answer was not ready, not clean, not aligned with what had been said before. Darius shifted his gaze briefly across the cabin, taking in the faces, the attention, the silence that had replaced noise, and when he spoke again, it was not to interrupt, but to place something into the moment that could not be ignored. "Captain," he said, calm, steady, "you are not dealing with a seating issue." A slight pause, measured, intentional. "You are dealing with a decision." And that word changed everything, because decisions imply responsibility, and responsibility demands accountability. And in that space, the power dynamic that had defined the last several minutes began to Reverse, not loudly, not suddenly, but with the quiet certainty of something that had always been there, waiting to be seen. The word decision did not fade. It settled, heavy and unavoidable, and for the first time since this began, no one rushed to speak over it. No one tried to redirect it, because once a moment is defined that clearly, it becomes harder to escape. Captain Reynolds held the tablet at his side now, no longer needing to look at it. The information already processed, already understood. His attention fully on the attendant whose earlier confidence had shifted into something tighter, more contained. Like someone trying to hold a line that was already breaking. "I am asking you again," he said, calm but firm. "Why was the seat reassigned?" And this time the question did not feel procedural. It felt personal, because it was no longer about the system. It was about intent. The attendant straightened slightly, drawing in a breath as if preparing to rebuild the narrative. "The passenger did not present valid identification," she said, choosing her words carefully, but the moment the sentence landed, it collided with everything the room had already seen. The scanned ticket, the confirmed seat, the absence of any flag, and the contradiction did not need to be pointed out. It was already visible. "That is not what happened," Emily said quietly, not stepping forward this time, not raising her voice. But her words carried anyway, because the room had shifted in her favor. He showed his boarding pass and his identification, and the simplicity of it cut through the complexity that had been constructed around the situation. A low murmur moved through the cabin again, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to signal alignment. A collective recognition that the story being told no longer matched the reality they had witnessed. Darius watched the exchange without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his presence now carried a different weight, not as someone being questioned, but as someone observing the outcome of a process he already understood. 10 years earlier, he had tried to correct the story himself, had spoken up, had pushed back, but learned quickly that when systems are used to support assumptions, truth alone is not enough unless it is acknowledged by those in control. And today, control was shifting. Captain Reynolds nodded once, slowly, as if confirming not just the facts but the pattern, then turned his body slightly toward the cabin, not addressing them directly, but acknowledging their presence, their role as witnesses in a moment that could no longer be contained or redefined. "We are not moving forward until this is resolved," he said, and the statement changed the atmosphere instantly, because it placed the weight of delay not on Darius, but on the situation itself, on the decision that had been made. The attendant's composure tightened further, her voice dropping. "Captain, this is unnecessary," she said, but the word unnecessary no longer held authority, because necessity had already been redefined by the evidence. Darius finally shifted his stance again, just slightly, his gaze steady as he spoke, not to challenge, not to accuse, but to clarify. "You told me I did not belong here," he said, his tone even, each word deliberate, "before you checked anything." A pause, brief but precise. That is not a system error. And in that sentence, the entire situation was distilled into something undeniable, something that could not be corrected with a screen or a policy, because it did not originate from either. The cabin felt quieter than before, not tense, not chaotic, but focused, as if everyone present understood that they were no longer watching a disagreement. They were witnessing a reveal, and in that space, Captain Reynolds made a decision of his own, not rushed, not reactive, but measured, as he lifted the intercom handset slowly, his eyes still on the attendant, and said in a tone that carried through the entire cabin, "Ground operations, this is Captain Reynolds. We are holding departure for internal review." And just like that, the moment crossed a line, from contained conflict to system-level consequence, and there was no going back. The words internal review did not just land. They spread, moving through the cabin faster than any announcement, because passengers understood what that meant even if they had never heard it before. It meant something had gone wrong at a level that could not be ignored. And for the first time since boarding began, the aircraft no longer felt like a place of departure. It felt like a place under scrutiny. The lead attendant's composure shifted again, this time more visibly, her shoulders tightening as she stepped closer to the captain, lowering her voice but not enough to escape the nearby rows. "Captain, "This is escalating unnecessarily," she said. But the word unnecessarily had lost all weight, because escalation had already been triggered by the decision she made minutes earlier. Captain Reynolds did not respond to her immediately, his attention now on the reply coming through his headset. A voice from ground operations confirming the hold, asking for clarification, asking for detail, and the captain's answer was measured, precise. "We have a manifest discrepancy involving a manual override," he said, each word chosen carefully, not dramatized, not softened, just stated. And in that clarity, the situation moved beyond the cabin, beyond the crew, into a system that documented everything. Darius remained where he was, still standing near the aisle, his presence unchanged. But now the space around him felt different, no longer confrontational, no longer dismissive, but aware, as if the cabin itself had recalibrated, recognizing something it had overlooked moments earlier. A passenger across the aisle lowered her phone slightly and whispered. He never raised his voice, and the man beside her nodded. He did not have to. And those quiet observations carried further than they intended, reinforcing what everyone could now see. That control had not come from volume, but from certainty. Emily stood a little straighter near the galley, her earlier hesitation replaced with quiet resolve, because the truth she had spoken was no longer isolated. It was supported, visible, undeniable. The couple seated in two shifted uncomfortably, the man glancing toward the captain, then at Darius, then back at his hands, as if unsure where to place his attention, while the woman slowly set her drink down, the comfort of the seat no longer matching the discomfort of the moment. "Sir," Captain Reynolds said finally, turning back toward Darius, his tone different now, not authoritative, not corrective, but acknowledging. "I need your full name for the report." And it was a simple request, procedural on the surface, but in this context, it carried significance, because it marked a transition from assumption to documentation, from dismissal to recognition. Darius met his gaze without hesitation, his voice calm, clear. "Darius Cole," he said, and the name settled into the space like a key turning in a lock, quiet but decisive. The captain nodded once, repeating it softly as if committing it to more than just the report, then turned slightly away, speaking again into his headset, relaying the name, the situation, the need for immediate oversight. Seconds passed, not many, but enough for the tension to rebuild in a different way, not around conflict, but around anticipation, because now the system beyond the cabin was listening, responding, and systems at that level do not move slowly when something is flagged. The attendant stood still now, no longer speaking, her earlier confidence replaced with a controlled silence that mirrored Darius's, but without the same foundation, without the same certainty. Darius shifted his gaze once more across the cabin, taking in the faces, the attention, the quiet understanding that had replaced doubt. And when he spoke again, it was not to the captain, not to the crew, but to the moment itself, his voice steady, measured. "This does not take long," he said, almost to himself, but loud enough to be heard. "When the right people are looking." And as if on cue, the captain's headset crackled again, sharper this time, more urgent, and whatever was said on the other end changed his expression in a way that no one could miss, subtle but unmistakable, as he straightened slightly, his grip on the intercom tightening just enough to signal that the situation was no longer contained within this aircraft. It had moved higher, and it was about to come back down. The crackle in the headset did not fade this time. It sharpened, cutting through the controlled quiet of the cabin as Captain Reynolds listened without interrupting, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly as the voice on the other end spoke with a level of urgency that no longer allowed interpretation, only action. "Understood," he replied finally, his tone measured but different now, carrying a weight that had not been there before, and when he lowered his hand from the headset, the entire cabin seemed to lean into the next second, waiting for what would follow. He turned toward Darius first, not the attendant, not the passengers, and that choice alone signaled everything that had changed. "Mr. Cole," he said, clearly, deliberately, "I have been instructed to pause all departure procedures effective immediately." And the words landed with precision, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but final in a way that no earlier command had been. A quiet wave moved through the cabin. Not confusion this time, but realization, as if the pieces that had been scattered across the last several minutes had finally aligned into something undeniable. The lead attendant stepped forward, her composure tightening once more as she tried to reclaim ground that no longer existed. "Captain, this is not necessary," she said. But the response came before she could finish, not from him, but through the intercom system itself as a new voice entered. Calm, authoritative, unmistakably external. "This is corporate operations," the voice stated, filling the cabin without raising volume. "All crew involved in the manifest override are to stand down pending immediate review." And just like that, the situation moved beyond discussion, beyond justification, into consequence. The attendant froze, not dramatically, but completely, as if the motion itself had been removed from her options, while Emily lowered her gaze for a moment, not in relief, but in recognition of what had just unfolded. The couple in 2A shifted again, the man clearing his throat quietly before stepping out of the seat without being asked, his earlier certainty replaced with something far less stable, while the woman followed, setting her drink aside with careful hands as if trying to minimize her presence in a moment that had grown too large to ignore. Darius did not move immediately. He did not step forward or sit down. He simply stood there, the center of a moment he had not forced but had allowed to reveal itself, his gaze steady as Captain Reynolds spoke again, this time to the cabin. "We will be addressing a seating correction before departure." And the phrasing was careful, respectful, intentional, because now the correction mattered as much as the error. 10 years earlier, Darius had walked away from a moment like this without resolution, without acknowledgement. But today there was no walking away, because the system itself had responded, had recognized, had corrected in real time. He took one step forward then, not rushed, not dramatic, just enough to close the distance between himself and the seat that had never truly stopped being his. And as he did, the space around him shifted once more, not out of obligation, but out of understanding. Captain Reynolds handed the tablet back without a word, his expression steady, then looked at the attendant one last time before turning away, because there was nothing left to debate, only to process. Darius paused beside seat 2A, his hand resting lightly on the headrest for a brief second before he spoke, his voice calm, carrying just far enough to reach those who had been watching from the beginning. "You did not remove me because of policy," he said, each word measured. "You removed me because of perception." A slight pause, not for effect, but for clarity. And that is what just grounded this plane. And in that sentence, the entire moment closed, not with noise, not with applause, but with a quiet understanding that lingered longer than any departure delay ever could.